Good afternoon. We appreciate everyone joining this Zoom webinar to help us launch the 2021 season of Great Decisions. This last year certainly has been eventful. No doubt anyone will ever forget 2020. Usually we kick off Great Decisions in mid-January in Tulsa, but delayed the kickoff this year due to the pandemic. I'm Mack Vanderlip, chair of the Great Decisions Committee, which is part of the Friends of the Tulsa City County Libraries. I'd like to thank and recognize the members of the Tulsa Great Decisions Committee for continuing to bring great decisions to Tulsa. The committee members are Eldon Eisenach, Richard Parker, Chris Cole, Janet Thomas, and me. Our committee is assisted by the Tulsa City County Library staff member, Lara Foley, who is a vital resource to the Friends of the Tulsa City County Library. I'd also like to recognize the president of the Friends Board, that's Dorothy Miner. Great Decisions is a program of the Nonpartisan Foreign Policy Association, and the FPA has been in existence since 1954. For those of you who have not participated in Great Decisions before, you should know that the Friends of the Tulsa City County Library have sponsored Great Decisions in Tulsa for more than 35 years. Great Decisions is America's largest discussion group on world affairs, with some 200,000 citizens participating each year nationwide. The program model involves reading the Great Decisions briefing books before each meeting, watching a DVD containing additional material at the meeting, then discussing the topic of the day. The Foreign Policy Association also provides additional reading material at its website, fpa.org. Each year in Tulsa, Great Decisions groups usually meet in churches and libraries. This year's the groups are starting on Zoom. Some have already started and others are getting underway. Groups meeting this year are All Souls Unitarian Church, Broken Arrow Library South, Herman and Kate Kaiser Library, Oklahoma Methodist Manor, Schusterman Benson Library, and the home of Janet Holland. For more information on these groups, you can visit the TCCL website, or there is a PDF attachment to this webinar. Each year, the FPA chooses 8 Great Decisions topics in an effort to develop an understanding of the issues and the choices facing all of us. This year's 8 topics are global supply chains and national security, Persian Gulf security issues, Brexit and the European Union, struggles over the melting Arctic, China's role in Africa, the Korean Peninsula, the roles of international organizations in a global pandemic, and the end of globalization. I believe that libraries, reading, and education promote an informed population that is vital to the foundation of our democracy. And that seems to be more important than ever before. You should consider membership in the Friends of the Tulsa City County Library to support this noble mission. Great Decisions is just one of the many programs which the Friends help organize and support. Other programs include Books Sandwiched In, Travels with Tulsans, the First Book Program, Creative Writing Contests for adults and young people, scholarships for library staff, and support to library volunteers, among many others. Friends membership material is available on the TCCL website. We don't do fundraising, so membership dues are the only way to support our program. I want to especially thank Eldon Eisenach for his efforts to encourage and make arrangements for today's keynote speaker. And with that, Eldon, would you please introduce her?
Video?
Yeah.
Hello. I'm very happy to introduce today's speaker, Lara Foley from the Sociology Department at the University of Tulsa. She's climbed the academic ladder so beautifully. She was a graduate student at University of Florida, an assistant professor beginning in 2001 at the University of Tulsa, then chair and associate professor of sociology. Then she became associate dean of global education for 2 years, 2014 to 2016, and now is an academic vice provost of global education. Her topic today is international education in a time of COVID. So here is Lara.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to the library and to the Great Decisions group for having me. And thank you, Eldon, for the introduction. I am excited to to talk to you all today about higher education, international higher education in a time of COVID and political change. So I guess we can get started, and then we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. Okay. And just to let you know, someone else is sharing my screen, so here it comes. Great, thank you. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So I want to just give you a little bit of background information on international higher ed, and really give some numbers to give context, but talk a little bit more about trends that are happening. So this chart just shows the numbers and the percent of change in the number of international students in the US from 2009 until 2020. These numbers do not reflect COVID. And so if you just look down the column with the percent of change, you see that 2014, 2015 was a huge boon for international students coming to the US. And then the growth started to slow down with a decrease in numbers starting in 2019, 2020. And so the challenges that higher ed is facing in terms of drawing international students to US institutions didn't begin with COVID. We've been in a bit of a decline for several years now. If you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, the growth peaked in 2014, 2015, and the decline started before COVID. What you can see in this chart is that the new student enrollment, so the last chart was all international students in the US. This is new students beginning from 2014 down to 2019. And we do see that start to decrease along with the last presidential administration in the US. And so there's some context there, and his decision to limit the number of people coming in created some of the challenge, but even just the perception of international students of whether they were welcome in the US was something we dealt with in higher ed. Go ahead to the next slide. The top destinations in the US for international students probably don't surprise you. There's some of the larger states and some of the states that have the most prestigious higher ed institutions. So California, New York, Texas, Massachusetts, and Illinois. The countries of origin that are at the top of the list are China, India, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, and Canada. Although if we look at the state of Oklahoma, Kuwait bumps Canada out of the number 5 spot, and we can all guess why that is. I know at the University of Tulsa, most of our international students have come to the university to study petroleum engineering. Okay, next. The top fields of study have historically been engineering, math, and business. And those are all, I think engineering and business are a little bit in decline. Math has held steady. One of the few areas of growth is the fine and applied arts. And so that's something I'm looking at closely as here at the University of Tulsa, we are trying to figure out how to get international students back on campus. Okay, next. The top sources of funding for how international students pay for higher ed in the US, more than half, it's personal and family support. About 21% have employers paying for their tuition. 17% have US colleges paying. That might be in a form of a scholarship or graduate assistantships. And foreign governments pay for about 3.5%. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but at the University of Tulsa, I would guess, if I had to guess, that foreign governments pay for closer to 50% of our international, well, maybe not 50, but a good 30% of our international students. And I might talk a little bit more about that later. And part of the reason we've been challenged, along with universities all across the United States, to maintain our enrollment numbers of international students. Okay, next. So of the major universities in Oklahoma, University of Oklahoma, about 5% of its student body are international students. And these numbers are from 2019, 2020. So they don't include this year. This year is probably wildly different than years past because of COVID. Oklahoma State has about 8%, and the University of Tulsa has about 16%. And if you remember back to the chart where 2014, 2015 was that huge year for international student enrollment, that year, I believe we had about close to 25% at the University of Tulsa were international students. Okay, go ahead, next slide. To say a little bit about mobility in the other direction, US students going abroad for typically the most likely amount of time US students go abroad is a summer or a shorter term experience. About 60% study abroad for a short term, about 30-ish percent, 38% maybe study abroad for a semester, and a very, very, very small number study abroad for a full year. About 16% of US students in bachelor's programs study abroad at some point during their time at university. Study abroad students are predominantly white and female. At the University of Tulsa, we do a slightly better job than the national average of sending men abroad, in part because we have really worked closely with the engineering colleges to give our students opportunities to go abroad and study engineering. Business and social sciences are the two largest contingents of disciplines where students are likely to go abroad. Okay, next. The top destinations for US students studying abroad are the UK, Italy, Spain, France, and Germany. Those don't really change. That's pretty consistent. They might trade places, but those Western European countries are where the most number of students go. Where we're seeing a lot of growth right now is Mexico, Greece, and South Korea. And I have my eye on Mexico for some reasons we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, next. So I just thought I'd share with you kind of the different kinds of challenges we faced in our international office when COVID came on board, and kind of initial challenges, the next stage challenges, and then where we think things might end up. So in those early months of COVID, if I recall January of 2020, for example, what we were dealing with in our office most was Chinese students. We have a large number of Chinese students at the University of Tulsa, worried about family members. Some of them were having challenges paying tuition because parents were locked down and couldn't get to the bank. And we had Chinese students who were dealing with some xenophobic remarks and comments from their classmates, and so, you know, we would certainly hear about that in our office. The next level probably started in February, when we were really every day, all day, watching the maps and which country, was going to be raised to a higher threat level next. Because we had, I think we had about 60 students, maybe more than that. We had students studying abroad all over the world. So we had to make sure we got them home. And, initially China was the one where we were bringing people home. And then I think Italy came next, and it just, eventually we had to get everyone home, and we had to do it quickly. There are stories of students who were traveling for the weekend and ended up leaving all their stuff behind because we needed to get them on a plane before the airport shut down. So that was quite intense. And honestly, by the time the US shut down in March, when we all went home and went into quarantine, I was kind of relieved by that point because our really intense efforts had happened throughout the month of February. Once everyone was home, and I should say, we also had to get the international students who wanted or needed to get home, help them get home too, before borders closed and whatnot. So there was a lot going on. Certainly a very expensive time too, of the university just needing to be responsible for the students. And so, some students bought their own tickets. We paid for some. It was chaotic, as you might imagine. The next challenge we faced after getting everyone home was having people complete their studies from a totally different time zone. And so they might have a class that they had to log on to Zoom in person, and for them, the class was at 3 o'clock in the morning. So that was quite a challenge. And the same for our classes at the University of Tulsa, where we had sent international students home, but they were still continuing distance learning. So that was those early months of the pandemic. And then our next stage, go to the next slide. The next stage was, okay, we have all these partnerships, all these universities we work with, all these places we send students and experiences that students can have. How do we, we can't travel. So how can we maintain those partnerships and give students at least some kind of international experience? And we were able pretty quickly to, like so many people around the world, having to pivot and change direction. And we did quite a few things virtually. We have a program where students typically travel abroad before they start at the university. And they go to Panama, and it's kind of a, this welcome to university life, and here's some idea of what it might be like to study abroad. We would just go for about a week, and we were able to put that all online. And we worked with our partners in Panama. They gave presentations, they gave tours of their companies, or in one case, we worked with some rainforest conservation folks, and they gave a tour of the rainforest. And because we were virtual, we were able to also bring in some people from Tulsa who maybe did similar things. So we had a company in Panama that made chocolate, and we brought in a chocolate maker from Tulsa as well. And they kind of were able to meet each other and share information. And for the students to see, hey, this is what entrepreneurship looks like in these different places. We also had a number of students who were prepared to travel for international internships. That was, in my mind, one of the most exciting ways that we were able to change direction, by putting those internships online. And so students still got a real experience of working with an international partner. They had weekly meetings typically, and the students would work on projects. And that whole experience went over very, very well. This fall, I'm teaching a class via Zoom with a colleague in Colombia. So her students and my students were doing some of the same classwork, and the students are working on in project teams together. We hope that once we can travel again, that we'll be able to also visit each other's cities. But for now, that has been a great way to maintain the international experience for students. One other example of the way we got creative is I think it's our French program, and a partner institution in France. They are doing virtual language buddies and practicing English and French through Zoom. Okay, next slide. So what I would say about the trends, both in international student mobility and in US students studying abroad, all of the pieces of internationalization on the university level, many of the trends leading to a decrease in this mobility were happening before COVID. Geopolitical situations that made it challenging for certain groups to travel to certain places. There's a growing middle class globally. And on the one hand, that you would think growing middle class means more people are seeking education, which is true, but more countries are able to provide that education for their citizens. So whereas students used to, if they wanted a top elite level education, had to come to the US or to the UK, that's not true anymore. And Asia in particular has some really world-class universities, and we're seeing more regional mobility. I'm seeing a question, but I'm gonna finish my thought before I get to that. So that regional mobility, it means that for the US and for higher ed institutions in the US, we are facing more competition than we ever had in the past. I see a question on the chat. I just heard that 1/3 of American doctors are foreign born. What percentage of the international students stay in America? And is it possible that we're doing a reverse brain drain, draining the educated from the rest of the world? Oh yeah, I think we definitely we definitely do that. I don't know the exact number of people who stay. I know that that is an area where we could do better. I mean, doctors perhaps have a better shot at this, but in the engineering and STEM science and technology fields, we don't always do a great job of keeping some of those international students. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. But as you mentioned, that also means we contribute to the brain drain from their home countries. Okay, so improved educational infrastructure. I think that's one of the trends that here in Oklahoma and at the University of Tulsa we've really seen, where, for example, Saudi Arabia, one of our top sending countries, is they have some universities now that can train their folks, and they don't need to come to the US. China is the same thing, another one of our top sending countries. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So here's where I see the opportunities post-COVID. I think that we'll be slightly less reliant on physical mobility. Well, I don't think we'll ever get away from that, because for anyone who's traveled, you know that there's nothing quite like being in another place. I think you can't just go to another place and expect to understand the culture. You have to actually interact with the people in that culture. And so doing that on Zoom isn't quite the same. But it is a way of, for example, for students, where we're wanting them to learn how to interact with people from all over the world. And so doing that via Zoom is better than not doing it at all, right? Of course, we'd love for people to continue to travel. And working in more collaboration with our partner universities, so that maybe the University of Tulsa and many universities have things like dual degree programs. So we have a couple institutions in China where the Chinese students take 2 years at their home institution, and then they come to Tulsa for 2 years, and they end up with degrees from both institutions. I think what we're going to see a lot more of is continuing those kind of programs, but a lot of it might be virtual, where a faculty member from Oklahoma may give a virtual class to a class of Chinese students. The Chinese students may be able to join into the US-based class. Virtual opportunities will allow for a lot more of those kind of opportunities. I think that if US institutions continue to, I mean, I'm going to just be honest here, many of us in international higher ed, our main goal is to make sure that students have the opportunity to learn to be global citizens. Institutions also have the goal of the bottom line, and international students for a long time have been a huge source of revenue for colleges and universities. So if that is starting to decline a little bit, and there's an interest in continuing to have some of that revenue, I think the best way to go is to focus on inbound study abroad programs. So historically, we've looked at having international students enroll in a US institution for a full degree, for 4 years, for 5 years, to get a degree. I think we're going to continue to see less of that, but there's opportunities to create shorter term experiences for those students. So they may be able to now go to university in their home country, but they still want to study abroad, so they could come for shorter periods to the US. I also mentioned expanding work opportunities after graduation for international students. OPT stands for, I always forget what it stands for, optional practical training. And so most of their visas include 3 to 5 years of this OPT. One thing that I see, at least in my world, other states and cities and places might do a better job of it, but here in Tulsa, I see businesses sometimes not being sure whether they could or should hire international graduates. And so I think that's partly a matter of educating companies. I don't think there's not a lot of paperwork for the company. The University of Tulsa continues to hold the and training opportunities for those international students. And then the other trend in international higher ed is to look at internationalization at home. Many cities, Tulsa included, have a very diverse population. And we can do more in terms of connecting our students with, say in Tulsa, for example, the Burmese community. We have a very large Burmese community, a very large Mexican community. So those are the kind of things that I see on the horizon as the where we're headed post-COVID. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Go ahead, and if you guys have any questions for Dr. Foley, go ahead and type those in the chat.
I'd love to hear if any of you studied abroad or were an international student at any point. While we're waiting for questions, I will just mention that during the time when President Trump was restricting entrance into the US, universities across the nation really, they got together, wrote letters. The economic impact of losing our international students is really huge. I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but you might imagine the University of Tulsa right now has about 620 international students. And because most of them are here for petroleum, they're coming from wealthy families and they spend a lot of money in Tulsa. What country do most of the students come to TU? China is the top sender, and the Chinese students are here for petroleum, but also a lot for business. And then our next highest senders are typically Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman. Again, almost always the oil producing countries that are our highest numbers. But we have students from we had at one point up to 80 countries represented. I think now we have 67 countries represented.
Do we get students from Africa?
Eldon just asked me if we get students from Africa. And that's a great question because it brings us back to that slide where I mentioned how students funded their studies. We do at the University of Tulsa have a few students from Africa. Nigeria is usually well represented, again, based on oil. The student mobility from Africa is not as strong as some of the other nations. And this is where we come back to that idea of the government sponsored programs. Again, typically, if someone's going to come to the US and pay full price tuition, because international students typically are paying full price tuition, they either need to have some family money or a sponsor through a company or a government. And so the governments that are sponsoring students change over time. We used to have a lot of students from Brazil. The Brazilian government was paying for that, and that program ended. And so we have a lot fewer students from Brazil. So other than Nigeria and Angola, I don't think we have a lot.
That's oil.
Yeah, the oil countries. So their employers typically are paying for their education. Do you think we'll see a decline in globalization or a big increase due to COVID? That's a great question. Did you read about foreign student data at Oral? Let me look and see if I have that data I know Oral Roberts has a lot of international students. I don't know why I missed that data. That is a great question, and I'll see if I can find that. Decline in globalization or big increase due to COVID. I think that's hard to say. I think that I'm teaching a class this term on global trends. And when I think about the global, and I let the students pick the global trends, we kind of went out and did some research, and everyone decided, we came together and picked our 5 most common global trends. And they were sustainability, the rise of populism, global inequality. What else did they pick? And like technology and big data kind of issues. So when I think about all of that and put all of that together, I think there's some things that lean towards we can't really back down from globalization. It's there. How do you retreat from that? But also indications that we may need to. And I know you guys were going to be talking about supply chains at some point. With what we experienced in the pandemic of closed, disruptions to supply chains, maybe we will see a more localization. The rise in populist leaders suggests that there might be more looking inward. I think it'll definitely be a very interesting time to watch and see what happens. Okay. I'm simultaneously trying to look for Oral Roberts and look at the next question. What type of visa is awarded to the students who try to further their education here in the US? Also, how long is the process? I am not an expert on those things. We do have people in our office who are. Students are usually here on a J or an F visa. I don't know how long the process is. I do know that's another thing I didn't mention in our, our initial COVID response was our poor coordinator for the immigration just had to watch every day and wait for news from the government to find out how the COVID conditions were impacting the requirements of the visas. And students wanted to know, do I have to go home? Can I do this? A great example is international students are not allowed to take more than, I think, 1 class virtually. And so now all of a sudden they were having to take all classes virtually because everyone was. And so we couldn't, common sense would say, well, of course you can do that because there's no other thing to do right now. But we had to wait to get that confirmation from the government. So that was a really, really crazy time. Do you feel the current administration will be more beneficial to your cause? I think, and this is not a comment on the Trump presidency overall, this is just a comment on international higher ed. I think it can only get better, but I'm not sure what that will look like. I think President Biden, along with leaders all over the world, have to be super focused on pandemic recovery right now. So I think it'll be a while before we see exactly what that looks like. I'm not aware of Chinese students wishing to defect. I've only been in this field for about 10 years. So that may have been an issue in the past. Typically, the Chinese students who want to stay here often find jobs, and those companies support their immigration or their green cards and in some cases citizenship. So I haven't seen that in my 10 years. Okay, there might be some more questions, but I'm also I know that I have a document that can tell me about the Oral Roberts that I forgot to. Let's see. No, it's not on here. I have University of Central Oklahoma and Oklahoma City University. I was trying to get access to the newest data, and it's not quite out yet. So I just have had some quick fact sheets for numbers, but I do know just from experience that Oral Roberts has a huge number of international students. Any other questions or comments? Well, once again, thank you all for having me. I'm going to put my email in the chat if anyone thinks of a question or just wants a connection at TU. There's my email. Happy to talk to anyone. And I don't know who's closing things up, Mack or Kara?
Back.
Usually we have cookies now.
Eldon tells me usually there's cookies now.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Laura. We very much appreciate your observations here, and we couldn't have done it without you. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.